In 2011, a team of researchers from Columbia University and the Israeli government published a landmark study looking into something colloquially known as the hungry judge effect. It's at least thought that hungry judges tend to make harsher rulings, and the scientific backing of this is in the idea of decision fatigue, where over time and over a series of decisions, our brains accumulate excesses of certain neurochemicals that make it hard to make complex decisions, but that these chemicals are restored by eating. So a hungry judge will be very depleted in their ability to make decisions. So what they're trying to figure out here is whether it really is the case that hungry or tired judges will make harsher decisions. So the team of researchers looked into over 1,000 parole rulings given by 8 different judges across an approximately 2-month period. And they found, surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, that much more than the severity of the person's offense or how many times they had reoffended, the most important factor in determining whether a judge would grant parole was the number of hours since they'd last had a meal break, where just after lunch or in the morning just after breakfast, they granted parole to about 65% of defendants. When it came to the time just before their next meal break, that rate was down to around 0%. While those other factors, like how many times the person had reoffended or whether they were seeking rehabilitation, were important, the most explanatory factor was the time that had elapsed since the judge's last meal break. Some scholars, like Dr. Robert Sapolsky, most notably of Stanford University, argue that this study provides some pretty clear evidence against the idea of free will, because of course these decisions by the judges, which are ostensibly meant to be free, are governed by a factor that is completely outside of their control and even completely external to the person's case, how hungry they were. And the real point here, like Sapolsky and others have argued, is not to say that because of this one study, free will is completely thrown out the window. It's really more pointing out the fact that there are plenty more factors than we usually think that are operating behind our decisions every day. So with this judge study in the back of our minds, I want to take you through a couple of other examples that show how things we typically assume to be totally free might be a lot more out of our control than we previously thought. Let's look at a different study, one that compared the outcomes of children who stayed in the lower income neighborhoods that they grew up in versus children who were born in those neighborhoods but then moved to higher income, more affluent neighborhoods sometime during childhood. And what this study found was that for each year of exposure to the higher income neighborhood, the kids' future incomes grew by about 4%. And the real genius here is in what the study was able to control for, because you've got the same kids coming from the same families, but switching their settings, a factor totally outside of one's control that makes a distinct, measurable difference later down the line in life. These studies are often called zip code studies because it's a catchy name for what's going on here, but it isn't about the zip code, right? It's about all of the things that go along with living in one zip code over another. You've got more access to better education, better transportation, better, healthier food, better support networks, more affluent people to network with, and on and on and on. All things that these kids didn't control, but that gives some of them a serious leg up later in life. And of course, the kids still had to work hard to get the grades, to get into the good schools, to get the better jobs, but when the connection between the neighborhood you grew up in and your future outcomes in life is this direct, it becomes a lot harder to chalk all of it up to individual effort. So, okay, you're saying, fine. There's plenty of things that happen in our lives that exert control over our decisions and our future outcomes that are outside of our control. Everyone knows this, right? You can't make a big decision in your life without some kind of outside influencing factors. So what about the hundreds or even thousands of completely innocuous micro choices we make every single day? Like something as simple as cracking our knuckles or flexing our fingers. Those must be voluntary and up to us, right? Well, some really interesting research on the brain in the 1980s actually suggested otherwise. Here's what they did. They had the subjects look at a fast-moving clock mounted on the wall right in front of them. And they used that clock to mark down exactly when they decided to make some very simple hand movement, like flexing their fingers. And then wherever the clock was at that particular moment, when they said, go, that's the time they recorded. And they also recorded using some really fancy neural imaging whatever hardware, the time that the motor impulse in the brain to flex the finger occurred. And so just to explain what that means really quickly, the way you perform any physical action is there's a neuron in your brain in the motor cortex that shoots a signal down your shoulder, down your arm, into your hand, and activates the muscles in your finger that then flex your finger. So the scientists here are comparing when the subjects perceptively perform the action versus when the actual brain signal that caused the action happened. And what they found was absolutely fascinating. It turned out that motor cortex signal to flex the finger happened 350 milliseconds before the subjects perceived moving their finger. So to say that again, the brain signal that caused the finger to move happened before the subjects were even aware of it, suggesting that they weren't actually in conscious control of when they decided to move their fingers. And we haven't even gotten yet to what might be the strongest argument against free will, which is the philosophical idea of determinism. So determinism essentially is just the view that every event, every decision, every action is logically predetermined. And it really rests on a very simple premise, which is just that everything that happens has a cause. And that's something that we observe in our daily lives, right? If I, drop this box of tissues, it falling to the floor and subsequently turning my light off had a cause, right? Gravity. And me, of course, releasing it. So what does this give us, right? Let's go back to my finger study example. So I move my finger. That's caused by neurochemical stuff that leads back to my motor cortex. And what someone who believes in free will there might say is that, okay, well, that motor cortex impulse that caused my finger to move was initiated by my conscious free will. Okay, that's one explanation. The actual explanation, though, is that motor cortex impulse was preceded by a previous neural impulse, and that one by a previous one, and that one by a previous one, and all the way back to the day we're born, which is when our and even before then, which is when our neurons really begin to fire. And we were born because our parents, birds and the bees, and all that stuff. And really, you can regress this stuff back as far as you like. And in fact, many determinists do, all the way to something like the Big Bang, or the start of the universe, at which point they can kind of just throw up their hands and say, either God did it or we don't know, and it doesn't really matter. But the point is, because everything that happened had a cause, everything that happened must have happened because all the events preceding it happened that caused it. So let's say you agree with me. You don't have any free will anymore. Well, what do you do from there? Do you go lay down in bed and just vegetate? Of course not. In fact, not believing in free will doesn't change anything about 95% of your life. But I do think that in the moments where free will can be just a little bit too much, abandoning it for a moment can be incredibly useful and might lead us towards a better society. So I think the best hypothetical example of a society that doesn't believe in free will, and the one that people usually give, is about the justice system and prison. Let's imagine somebody's a thief. They ran up behind an old lady and snatched her purse. Bad guy, criminal. Under our current system that assumes agency and free will, this person is bad. They are somehow intrinsically morally flawed. And they, of their own desire and their own volition, have hurt somebody else. So the appropriate response is to punish them, right? To put them in jail, to subject them to violence and abuse potentially, and to give them a worse path in life because they can't be educated and they'll have a bad job and make no money and then have a black mark on their record for the rest of their life, right? That's all justified because they chose to do something wrong. That actually benefits no one. It doesn't benefit the convict. It doesn't benefit the old lady. It doesn't benefit our society, most of all. But a framework that acknowledges the reality that free will doesn't exist is a much better one, I think, for all of us. Because under that framework, this person is not inherently bad. They need help, really. So a prison under this kind of system looks much more like an educational reform institution where these people can be educated, come out with good jobs that prevent them from having to steal again, because as we know, almost all crime is out of perceived necessity on the part of the criminal. And yes, some kind of happy, nice, friendly system like this costs a lot more money, but Keeping people in jail also costs a lot of money. And the reality of the matter is that within 10 years, 80% of prisoners who get out are rearrested, with around half of those actually going back to prison. The other reality is that these people aren't able to contribute to the economy nearly as much as their innate potential might suggest if they were just given the opportunity. How does all this stuff apply to you? I think really in two major ways. The first of which has to do with yourself and your capacity for self-understanding and self-compassion. So let's say you screw up. Let's say you had a fight with a friend, you said something wrong, did something wrong, and now they're not your friend anymore. If you believe in free will, you might descend into some combination of guilt and self-pity and blame and you messed up. You're a bad person. But if you let go of that free will, that responsibility to some extent, for just a few moments, you realize that all this stuff was going to happen, whether you wanted it to, whether you did anything differently. 'Cause you couldn't do anything differently. It's impossible. Now, I'm not telling you to obfuscate responsibility and throw up your hands and say, well, guess that was fate. I guess I'm never going to talk to Jimmy again. But that's not the right way to go here. Personal responsibility is still absolutely crucial in these moments. But taking just a few moments to step back from your own responsibility, to grant yourself a moment of self-compassion, can avoid all of this kind of nasty, silly, emotional, self-flagellating garbage that comes with our parasitic attachment to free will. It can be incredibly powerful to allow yourself to live in a more forgiving reality of yourself. And this applies to other people as well, and kind of similar to the criminal example. Let's say somebody cuts you off in traffic. Your gut reaction might be to flip them off, curse them out, and then go cut them off at the next light. Not only is that dangerous, it's also just bad for you mentally. It's not nice to walk around with negativity for other people, but if you acknowledge that when people do stupid shit to you, it's not them acting, it's not them being bad, it was just gonna be that way. It just is what it is, and they're not to blame for it. You carry a lot less resentment with you all the time. It's really wonderful. And even when things do come to conflict, which they still will, no matter how zen you think you can make yourself, being the calmer head in an argument is the first step towards winning that argument, or better yet, bringing the other person on to your side. Giving up free will is not giving up on life. All it is leaving this dead weight, this burden of free will behind. Okay, if you've made it this far, I sincerely thank you for watching the entire video. And I just wanted to touch really briefly on something that Dr. Sapolsky said in an interview on this great podcast with a guy called Alex O'Connor. So, Sapolsky was talking about how he thinks that the world has become better. And with that change, which is true, and concomitant with that change has been a reduction in our society's, or in human society's, belief in free will. But I disagree. I think that actually our society has become more tolerant to free will as it's progressed, and that actually has made our society better in a lot of ways, but it doesn't mean that we can't continue to improve by now, as a more enlightened people, casting off those chains. So one example he gives, which I think is again a kind of a bad one, is that we used to blame adverse weather events like hurricanes or tornadoes or droughts on the actions of people, and that the gods were punishing us because we had made them angry. And so the solution to that was to sacrifice people to them. It's obviously a bad thing to do. And Sapolsky says that as we realized what actually caused these weather events, so science, not human error, we stopped sacrificing people. So it's not true. We still don't really know what causes all these weather events. We just stopped sacrificing people because we realized that it was wrong and barbaric. So we haven't really lost free will in this case, at least not in the way that he's saying. But the bigger point here is that as we've become more secular as a species, we have gained a much stronger concept of free will. People used to say all the time, more people than now used to say, God has a plan, or it's fate, or the Greeks believing that the spinners of fate would have all of their destiny like in the Odyssey. Now it's all about self-determination. It's all about hard work. It's all about bootstraps. It's all about you're the master of your own ship. All of these things. And in a lot of ways, it's made us a more successful people. It's a key part of the American, the Western ethos, that we should, one, keep religion out of government, and two, we have self-determination and freedom and all these things. I find it funny, though, that the phrase to pull yourself up by your bootstraps used to be satire. Because, of course, you can't actually lift yourself off the ground by pulling up on your boots. It was a decidedly anti free will thing to say, but we all know what that phrase means today.